Mexico, 1985. A U.S. federal agent screams under torture in a house in Guadalajara. Hours later, in Washington, the news triggers an alarm that will never turn off again. For the first time, the war on drugs stops being political discourse and becomes a personal vendetta. The name behind that diplomatic storm begins to echo in intelligence offices, embassies, and military barracks. Rafael Caro Quintero. To some, a peasant who rose too quickly. To others, the architect of Mexico's first modern narco-trafficking empire. To the DEA, the man who crossed a line that no one should cross. Long before becoming an international fugitive, long before appearing on the FBI's most wanted list, he had already changed forever the way drugs were produced and distributed across North America. From the mountains of Badiraguato to the corridors of power in Guadalajara, Caro Quintero built in less than a decade a criminal machinery without precedent. An agricultural complex of 1,000 hectares capable of producing thousands of tons of marijuana per year. A network of protection that included police, military, and officials. An alliance that would give rise to the Guadalajara Cartel, and with it, to modern narco-trafficking in Mexico. But every empire that grows too fast leaves traces. And when an undercover agent discovered the heart of his operation, the response was not flight. It was confrontation. This is the story of how a young man from the Golden Triangle went from cultivating marijuana in the mountains to becoming the top priority target of the United States government. The story of the man they called the drug lord of drug lords, and the mistake that turned him into a legend. Chapter 1. Origins in the Mountains. Sinaloa, 1950s. Before the cartels, before the major international routes, and long before narco-trafficking became a global phenomenon, there existed a silent parallel economy in the mountains of northwest Mexico. On the 24th of October 1952, in La Noria, municipality of Badiraguato, Rafael Caro Quintero was born. An isolated region, with dirt roads, subsistence agriculture, and virtually non-existent opportunities. Badiraguato was not just another town. It was part of a mountainous strip that would come to be known as the Golden Triangle, the intersection between Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango. A rugged territory, difficult to penetrate, ideal for clandestine crops and even more ideal for hiding them. Rafael was the eldest of 11 siblings. When his father, Emilio Caro Payan, died, the teenager was only 13 years old. Childhood ended immediately. With no education beyond 6th grade, he assumed responsibilities beyond his years. Legal agriculture was not enough to sustain a large family. In that region, the line between survival and crime was increasingly blurred. During those years, marijuana and poppy cultivation were not perceived locally as part of a sophisticated criminal structure. They were an economic alternative tolerated ambiguously by local authorities and security forces. Many peasants saw it as the only way out against government abandonment. At 14 years old, Rafael began participating in clandestine plantations. Not as a leader, not as an organizer, as one more in an illegal economy that already functioned with some structure. But something set him apart. It was not violence. It was ambition. Rather than limiting himself to cultivation, he began to observe. He learned production cycles, harvest times, concealment methods, and above all, transportation routes. He understood that true power lay not in planting, but in controlling the flow. At 16, he decided to leave the mountains in search of better opportunities. He relocated to Caborca, in the state of Sonora. There he worked as a rancher and later as a cargo truck driver. That job allowed him to learn roads, military checkpoints, inspection procedures, and vulnerable points on routes heading north. It was valuable information. And in the world that was taking shape, information was worth more than force. At 18, the encounter that would change his trajectory occurred. Pedro Avilés Pérez, known as the Lion of the Sierra, was then one of the main drug traffickers in the region. He operated smuggling networks toward the United States in a stage prior to the consolidation of the major cartels. Avilés was not looking for amateurs. He was looking for young men who were discreet, disciplined, and capable of learning. Rafael fit that profile. Under Avilés' tutelage, he stopped being just another cultivator and began to understand the real dimension of the business. He learned to negotiate shipments, to organize operative cells, and to establish strategic contacts. He discovered that narco-trafficking was not just clandestine cultivation. It was logistics, structure, and political protection. His formal education was limited, but his capacity to identify opportunities was exceptional. Within a few years, he began to consolidate his own network within marijuana trafficking. He no longer depended exclusively on intermediaries. He was starting to build autonomy. The 1970s were about to begin. Drug demand in the United States was growing, driven by cultural and social changes. Federal pressure was increasing, but so were profit margins. Rafael Caro Quintero understood something before many others. The business was about to transform, and he did not want to be an employee in that change. He wanted to lead it. Chapter 2: The Architecture of the First Major Cartel. Late 1970s. The drug business in Mexico did not yet have the form it would acquire in later years. There were traffickers, regional networks, and informal agreements, but no centralized organization with national ambitions. That void began to fill after the death of Pedro Avilés Pérez in 1978. His fall left a space that could not remain empty for long. In that scenario, three figures emerged who understood that the future of the business lay not in competing with each other, but in coordinating. Miguel Ángel, Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero. Each brought something different. Félix Gallardo had political connections and experience in institutional protection. Fonseca Carrillo possessed operative networks and knowledge of smuggling. Caro Quintero brought large-scale production and a different mindset. He thought in industrial terms. From that alliance was born what would later become known as the Guadalajara Cartel. It was not a formal founding, nor a public act. It was a strategic agreement that reorganized Mexico's criminal map. For the first time, trafficking stopped functioning as a collection of isolated cells and began to operate as a coordinated structure, with territory distribution, defined routes, and clear hierarchies. Within that organization, Caro Quintero assumed a specific role, turning marijuana production into a massive and standardized operation. Until then, cultivation was irregular, scattered, and dependent on small producers. He sought efficiency, control, and volume. He introduced methods to maximize the production of seedless female plants, known for their higher THC concentration. The objective was not only to increase potency, but to reduce unnecessary weight and optimize transportation. More value per kilogram meant higher margins and less exposure on routes toward the United States. Demand on the north side of the border was growing steadily. The decade after Vietnam had generated a wide and stable market. What was lacking was the capacity to supply it constantly. Caro Quintero decided to build that capacity. In the state of Chihuahua, in a remote and difficult-to-access zone, a project began to develop that would change the history of Mexican narco-trafficking, Rancho El Búfalo. It was not a simple plantation hidden in the mountains. It was an agricultural complex at an industrial scale, approximately 1,000 hectares, dedicated exclusively to marijuana cultivation, technified irrigation systems, armed surveillance, access control, worker encampments. No. Permanent logistics for harvest and packaging. Estimates by Mexican and US authorities speak of thousands of tons annually. Some reports mentioned up to 8,000 tons at the height of production. Beyond the exact number, what was relevant was the magnitude. No other complex of that size had been documented until then. It is estimated that thousands of day laborers worked there. many recruited from marginalized communities, under precarious and strictly monitored conditions. The ranch functioned like a small isolated city whose sole purpose was to produce drugs uninterruptedly. The message was clear. Narco-trafficking was no longer improvisation. It was infrastructure. Profits began to multiply. The constant flow toward the United States consolidated Caro Quintero's reputation as one of the most important producers on the continent. But accelerated growth had an inevitable cost: visibility. An agricultural complex of those dimensions could not remain invisible forever. And in Washington, pressure to stop the flow of Mexican drugs was beginning to intensify. While the Guadalajara Cartel expanded its influence, a new variable entered the scene: direct intervention by U.S. agencies in Mexican territory. The empire was growing, surveillance as well, and in the heart of that gigantic plantation, without Caro Quintero knowing it yet, the threat that would change his destiny was already taking shape. Chapter 3: Money, Power, and International Expansion. In the early 1980s, Rafael Caro Quintero had not yet turned 30, yet he was already operating with figures that surpassed the annual budget of many Mexican municipalities. Rancho El Búfalo had not only demonstrated that production could be industrialized, it had shown that narco-trafficking could be organized like a business. Money began to flow in unprecedented quantities. And with the money came something even more dangerous: influence. Guadalajara became the new center of operations, far from the mountains, far from rural isolation. There, in one of the most important cities in the country, the Guadalajara Cartel began to weave relationships with businessmen, politicians, and security officials. The success of marijuana was barely the first step. The real transformation occurred when the group decided to integrate into an international cocaine trafficking network. Until that moment, Mexico had primarily been a transit territory. Colombia produced, the United States consumed, Mexico transported. But the Guadalajara Cartel understood that transit could also become control. During those years, Colombian organizations, including the one led by Pablo Escobar, sought more efficient routes to introduce cocaine into the United States. The Caribbean was increasingly watched. Mexico offered a strategic alternative. The agreements were not improvised. Mechanisms for reception, storage, and redistribution were established. Mexico stopped being a mere corridor and began to consolidate as an indispensable logistical partner. That changed the balance of the business. Profits multiplied, routes diversified, overland toward California and Arizona, maritime across the Pacific, aerial through clandestine airstrips in northern states. The Guadalajara Cartel began to operate with a structure that included regional managers, financial officers, and political liaisons. Institutional protection was not a rumor, it was part of the system. In a country marked by decades of political hegemony and vertical control of power, corruption was not a complex obstacle to overcome. Local police, judicial commanders, and federal officials began to form part of the protection network, not all by conviction, many by pressure, others by direct benefit. The line between authority and crime began to blur. By the early 1980s, estimates of Caro Quintero's fortune varied, but some sources placed it in the hundreds of millions of dollars. He acquired properties in different states across the country and invested in legitimate businesses: hotels, nightclubs, car dealerships. The message was deliberate. He no longer hid in the mountains. Now he occupied visible spaces. His style was flashy: designer clothes, luxury vehicles, exclusive meetings in Guadalajara. In a city accustomed to the discretion of traditional elites, his presence generated a mixture of fascination and rejection. In the midst of that ascent, he met Sara Cosío Vidaurri, niece of a former governor of Jalisco. The relationship provoked public scandal. It was not merely a love story. It represented direct proximity between emerging criminal power and the traditional political circle. Impunity seemed consolidated. Meanwhile, within the Guadalajara Cartel, a new generation of operators was forming. Among them stood out a young Sinaloense who would later gain international notoriety, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán Loera. The model they were building was not ephemeral, it was a school. By the mid-1980s, the Guadalajara Cartel controlled a substantial portion of trafficking toward the United States. It coordinated production, cocaine reception, distribution, and political protection. The balance seemed solid. But in Washington, patience was wearing thin. The US government had intensified its anti-drug strategy following the declaration of the war on drugs driven by the Reagan administration. Diplomatic pressure on Mexico increased. Visible results were demanded. And when a criminal structure reaches such large dimensions, it inevitably makes a mistake. Not necessarily from weakness, sometimes from overconfidence. The Guadalajara Cartel had achieved something that no previous group had managed, centralizing trafficking and maximizing profits. But at that same moment, an undercover agent began to observe too closely. And the next move would not be financial. It would be personal. Chapter 4, the mistake that changed everything. By 1984, the Guadalajara Cartel was operating with a confidence that bordered on recklessness. But while the organization celebrated its power, a man worked in Guadalajara who did not fit the usual pattern of corruption. Enrique, Kiki Camarena, former U.S. Marine, DEA agent assigned to the consulate in Guadalajara. His task was clear: identify and dismantle the structures flooding the North American market with drugs. Camarena did not come to Mexico to make public statements. He came to observe. For months, he gathered information about plantations, routes, and names. He did not work alone. He had local informants and sources within Mexican security bodies. Little by little, one piece began to stand out above the rest: an agricultural complex of unusual dimensions in the state of Chihuahua. Rancho El Búfalo. In November 1984, the information led to an unprecedented operation. More than 400 Mexican Army personnel stormed the area. The plantation was destroyed. The blow was not only economic, it was symbolic. For the first time, the Guadalajara Cartel's infrastructure was publicly exposed. For Rafael Caro Quintero, that was not simply a financial loss. It was a betrayal. Suspicion centered on a leak. Someone had talked. Someone had pointed with surgical precision. On the 7th of February 1985, in broad daylight, in front of the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara, Enrique Kiki Camarena was intercepted and kidnapped. Hours later, Mexican pilot Alfredo Zavala Avelar was also captured. Both were taken to a safe house. What happened in the following hours was later documented in recordings and court testimony. Interrogations, prolonged violence, pressure to reveal sources, and informants. The objective was to obtain names, to know who had collaborated with the DEA. But the damage had already been done. The bodies were found weeks later in a rural area of Michoacán. The news crossed the border at a speed that exceeded any cartel calculation. The killing of a U.S. federal agent in Mexican territory changed the nature of the conflict. It was no longer just narco-trafficking. It was a direct challenge. In Washington, the reaction was immediate. The DEA launched the most extensive operation in its history up to that point. Its sole objective was to identify and capture everyone responsible. Diplomatic pressure on Mexico intensified in an unprecedented way. Bilateral relations entered a phase of open tension. Caro Quintero went from being a powerful producer to becoming an international priority. In March 1985, he left Guadalajara. Together with Sara Cosio, he flew to Central America, trying to hide under the appearance of a businessman. The destination was Costa Rica. But the margin for maneuvering was minimal. Communications were intercepted. Calls were traced. On the 4th of April 1985, in San Rafael de Ojo de Agua, Costa Rica, local security forces acted after receiving precise information. Rafael Caro Quintero was detained without armed confrontation. Cameras captured his transfer. The man who had operated in the shadows for years now appeared handcuffed. Sara Cosio publicly declared that she had not been kidnapped. That statement did not change the course of events. Mexico requested his immediate extradition. Extradition to the United States did not occur then. He would be tried in Mexican territory. But the message was already clear. The Guadalajara Cartel had crossed a line that no criminal group had crossed before, and the consequences would not be limited to an individual conviction. What was about to happen would transform the narco-trafficking map in Mexico forever. Chapter 5. The Conviction and Fragmentation. Rafael Caro Quintero's trial was not an ordinary proceeding. From the start, it was marked by international pressure without precedent. The United States demanded results. Mexico needed to demonstrate control. The killing of a DEA agent had placed the Mexican judicial system under the world's spotlight. The charges were multiple: kidnapping, murder, narco-trafficking, and organized crime. During the process, the figure of the accused was no longer that of the innovative producer or the rising criminal entrepreneur. He was the visible face of a diplomatic crisis. On the 12th of December 1989, a sentence was handed down: 40 years in prison. The image was striking. The man who had coordinated an international network, who had moved tons of drugs and negotiated with political structures, was now transferred under custody to a maximum security penal facility. He was admitted to Federal Readaptation Center No. 1, known as Altiplano, in the state of Mexico, a place designed to house criminals considered to be the highest risk. Routines changed drastically. No private escorts. No exclusive circles. No ability to decide over territories. But his fall had an effect far deeper than his imprisonment. The Guadalajara Cartel was not built on a shared ideology, but on a balance of power. With its main leaders detained Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and later Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, that balance broke. The centralized structure began to fragment. What had until then been a coordinated organization divided into regional fiefdoms. Each group inherited routes, contacts, and operators. From that fracture emerged new organizations that would dominate the following decades. The Sinaloa Cartel, the Tijuana Cartel, the Juárez Cartel. Decentralization did not bring stability. It brought competition, and competition brought violence. Paradoxically, the capture of the Guadalajara Cartel's leaders did not weaken Mexican narco-trafficking in the long term. It transformed it. It went from a relatively coordinated model to a scenario of constant territorial disputes. Meanwhile, inside prison, the figure of Caro Quintero began to become a myth. During the economic crisis that struck Mexico in the 1980s, a persistent story circulated that he had offered to pay the country's external debt if he was released. There is no formal evidence to support that claim, and Caro Quintero himself denied having made it. But the rumor served its purpose. It turned him into a legend, a drug trafficker with sufficient resources to compete symbolically with the state. In prison, he maintained communication with his family circle. U.S. authorities suspected that part of his financial network remained active through third parties. There was no conclusive evidence that he directed operations from prison, but his name still carried weight in certain regions. Time advanced. Outside, violence escalated. New leaderships emerged. The war between factions began to mark the north of the country. Inside, the former drug lord of drug lords observed how the world he had helped build mutated without him. Yet his story was not over. What seemed like a definitive conviction was about to become, decades later, one of the most controversial judicial episodes in recent Mexican history. And that decision would reopen a wound that had never healed. Chapter 6, 28 years later. For nearly 3 decades, the name of Rafael Caro Quintero stopped occupying daily headlines but never completely disappeared. In prison, he maintained contact with his closest family. The administration of his assets remained in the hands of associates and the mother of his children, while U.S. Authorities maintained the suspicion that part of his financial structure survived through third parties. There was no conclusive public evidence demonstrating that he directed operations from prison. But in the world of narco-trafficking, influence does not always depend on direct orders. Sometimes the weight of a name is enough. In 2007, he was transferred to the Federal Penal Facility in Puente Grande, Jalisco. The transfer was presented as an administrative decision linked to security and internal control. However, each transfer altered his conditions of confinement and his immediate surroundings. 3 years later, in 2010, a constitutional remedy modified his situation once again. A judge determined that his current dangerousness had not been proven under certain procedural criteria, which allowed his relocation to a different penitentiary facility. Meanwhile, the Mexican legal context was undergoing relevant changes. Procedural reforms and reviews of jurisdiction began to open legal spaces that years before would not have existed. His defense team worked constantly. It was not an isolated remedy, but a prolonged strategy based on procedural technicalities and challenges regarding the jurisdiction that had convicted him. The DEA, for its part, had not closed the chapter. For U.S. authorities, the murder of Enrique Kiki Camarena did not expire either politically or symbolically. Each attempt at judicial review was observed closely. During those years, inside and outside prison, his figure acquired an almost mythical component. Narcocorridos, oral accounts, and conflicting versions fed a narrative where reality and fiction began to merge. But on the 9th of August 2013, something occurred that no one anticipated. The first collegial court in criminal matters of the Third Circuit issued a resolution that completely altered the landscape. It determined that the original process had been conducted in federal jurisdiction when, according to its interpretation, the case should have been processed at the local level. The legal argument centered on the victim's status. The court held that, without formally establishing Camarena's diplomatic or consular status, federal jurisdiction was improper. The consequence was immediate: an order for release. There was no prior announcement. There was no diplomatic preparation. In the early morning, after 28 years in prison, Rafael Caro Quintero left the Puente Grande penal facility. The news caught the U.S. government by surprise. Officials from the Department of Justice publicly expressed their disagreement. The DEA stated that it would continue pursuing the case. Within hours, the man who had spent nearly 3 decades confined became a fugitive again. Because while he was leaving the prison, a new arrest warrant was already being prepared. The story that seemed to close in 1989 had just reopened, and this time, the pursuit would be different. Chapter 7: The Return of the Fugitive. The early morning of the 9th of August 2013 was not just a prison release. It was a legal escape. Rafael Caro Quintero crossed the gate of the Puente Grande penal facility without an orange uniform, without visible handcuffs, and without media spectacle. But in political terms, the impact was immediate. Within hours, the news crossed borders. In Washington, it was interpreted as an affront. In Mexico, as a judicial error of historical dimensions. By then, he was 60 years old. The country he was returning to was not the same he had left in 1985. Narco-trafficking was no longer centralized. Organizations were more violent, more fragmented, and technologically more sophisticated. And he was no longer the young, ambitious producer. He was a symbol. After leaving the prison, he disappeared. The first weeks were marked by constant speculation. Unconfirmed reports placed him in the Sinaloa mountains, in rural zones of the Golden Triangle, moving with small groups and avoiding any predictable pattern. Accounts pointed to an austere lifestyle, far from the ostentatious profile of decades earlier. Temporary shelters, discreet movements, minimal electronic communication. Meanwhile, the institutional reaction was accelerating. On the 16th of January 2015, the Supreme Court of Justice of the nation revoked the decision that had permitted his release. It determined that the collegial court had exceeded its jurisdiction. With that ruling, a new arrest warrant was issued. Caro Quintero once again became formally a fugitive. U.S. government intensified diplomatic pressure. The Department of Justice confirmed that it would seek his extradition once he was detained. The DEA reiterated that the Camarena case remained open. The FBI took an additional step. They included his name in the list of the 10 most wanted fugitives and announced a reward of $20 million for information leading to his capture. It was a figure reserved for high-profile international targets. The message was unmistakable. He was not a regional target. He was a strategic priority. In the midst of that global pursuit, in 2016, an unexpected event occurred. The journalist Anabel Hernandez managed to interview him in hiding. The encounter was made public and showed an aged man, serene in appearance, who denied current ties to criminal organizations and claimed to have lost his fortune during his imprisonment. He declared having no conflicts with other groups and stated that he had no intention of returning to narco-trafficking. But while he spoke those words, in the north of the country, readjustments of territorial control were beginning to be recorded. The void he had left was not completely filled, and in certain zones of Sonora and Sinaloa, reports emerged of new alliances, local disputes, and movements that some analysts indirectly linked to his figure. There was no public judicial evidence accrediting direct operational leadership. However, in the Mexican criminal ecosystem, the return of a historic name could alter balances without needing formal declarations. The debate intensified. Was he an ex-capo trying to survive in silence? Or an actor seeking to regain influence by taking advantage of the fragmentation of the criminal map? As rumors grew, Mexican and U.S. intelligence agencies coordinated discrete operations, aerial surveillance, communications monitoring, tracking of possible intermediaries. The pursuit extended for years. Each sighting generated expectation. Each false lead fed the myth. The man who had been sentenced 4 decades earlier was moving in the shadows again, in a country where violence no longer responded to a single command, but to multiple centers of power. But room for maneuvering was shrinking. And this time, technology was working against him. Chapter 8: The Myth, the Dispute, and the Shadow. After his release and subsequent declaration as a fugitive, the name of Rafael Caro Quintero reappeared in Mexican and U.S. intelligence reports. From 2016 and 2017 onward, various agencies pointed to the possible reactivation of a criminal group in the region of Sonora and northern Sinaloa, especially in the corridor connecting with Arizona. Some official reports began to refer to that structure as the Rafael Cartel. Authorities attributed that readjustment to operators historically linked to Caro Quintero. However, for years there were no judicial sentences formally confirming his direct leadership in that organization. What was verifiable was the increase in violence in certain strategic zones of Sonora. Border municipalities recorded armed confrontations, roadblocks, and disputes over traffic routes. In that context, the name of Caro Quintero was mentioned again as a possible actor of influence, especially in indirect confrontations with factions associated with the Sinaloa cartel. Within that organization, one of the most visible sectors was headed by the sons of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán Loera, known in the media as Los Chapitos. Security analysts pointed out that control of the corridors toward Arizona became a friction point between different groups. The border remained the central objective. Whoever controlled the crossings controlled the flow of income. In parallel, episodes of high media impact occurred. In June 2016, an armed group attacked the area of La Tuna, in Badiraguato, the birthplace of the Guzmán family. Months later, in August, the temporary kidnapping of Guzmán's sons occurred in a restaurant in Puerto Vallarta. Various journalistic accounts and intelligence leaks linked those incidents to circumstantial alliances between different criminal actors. However, no judicial ruling formally established the direct participation of Caro Quintero in those events. What is certain is that the criminal map of Northwest Mexico was experiencing a constant reconfiguration phase. Unlike the 1980s, narcotrafficking now operated with decentralized structures, intensive use of technology, and more sophisticated financial schemes. Authorities detected increasing use of drones for surveillance, encrypted communications, and diversification of money laundering methods, including digital assets and shell companies. If Caro Quintero exercised influence in that environment, he did so in a scenario completely different from what he had known in his youth. The contrast was evident. In the 1980s, power was concentrated in visible figures. In the 2010s, leadership tended to fragment and operate by cells. Meanwhile, his public figure acquired an increasingly symbolic component. For some sectors of narcotrafficking, he represented a connection to the old guard. For others, he was simply a historical name used as a reference. The question began to divide opinions among analysts. Was he really an active operative actor? Or did his name function as a cohesion element for groups seeking internal legitimacy? U.S. authorities did not hesitate to consider him a current threat. The reward amount and his continued presence on the most wanted list reflected that perception. However, for years he managed to stay out of reach. The man who had been convicted in 1989 and released by a controversial ruling became a spectral figure once again. He did not appear publicly. He did not grant additional interviews. He did not send messages. But his name continued to circulate in reports, briefings, and security analysis. Until 2022, when the search that had extended for nearly a decade narrowed once more. And this time, there would be no second chance. Chapter 9. The Last Hunt. For nearly 9 years, Rafael Caro Quintero was a priority target for Mexican and U.S. agencies. His name appeared in intelligence reports, press conferences, and official statements. For Washington, it remained an outstanding debt since 1985. For Mexico, it was a case symbolizing a historic wound in bilateral relations. During that period, versions circulated about his possible indirect influence in criminal structures in the northwest of the country. There was also talk of social protection networks in rural communities and a cultivated image as an old-school figure. However, beyond intelligence reports, there were no sentences formally accrediting new convictions against him for those acts. What was indisputable was that the search continued. Following several failed operations and multiple discarded leads, naval intelligence managed to pinpoint a specific location in the municipality of Choice, Sinaloa, in a mountainous area near the borders with Chihuahua and Sonora. On the 15th of July 2022, the Navy Department deployed a joint operation with the Attorney General's office. There was no open confrontation. According to the official report, it was a canine unit that allowed him to be located hidden in dense vegetation. The image later released showed a man of 69 years old, visibly aged, with dyed hair and dressed discreetly. The scene contrasted with photographs from the 1980s. He was no longer the young producer who appeared in magazines, nor the businessman who toured Guadalajara. He was a fugitive, captured after nearly a decade of pursuit. Mexican authorities announced the detention as a relevant achievement in international cooperation. In the United States, the Department of Justice reiterated that it would seek his extradition to face pending charges for the kidnapping and murder of Enrique Camarena. However, the operation was marked by tragedy. That same day, a Black Hawk helicopter of the Navy crashed in the vicinity of Los Mochis, Sinaloa. 14 naval soldiers lost their lives. The Navy Department reported that the accident was under investigation and that there were no initial signs of a direct attack. The capture became inevitably associated with that human loss. Meanwhile, Caro Quintero was transferred once again to Federal Readaptation Center No. 1, the same maximum security prison where years earlier he had been held. A new judicial stage then began. The United States formalized the extradition request. The detainees' defense filed legal remedies to halt the process, arguing procedural guarantees and fundamental rights. Thus, opened a legal battle that reactivated the debate over sovereignty, bilateral cooperation, and the scope of extradition agreements between both countries. The then Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, publicly declared that the capture had been executed by Mexican forces, underlining national autonomy in the operation. But beyond official discourse, the meaning was evident. With his detention, the cycle closed of one of the last emblematic leaders to emerge in the foundational stage of modern narco-trafficking in Mexico. The man who had participated in consolidating the country's first major cartel was behind bars again. This time, with no margin for a second controversial release. Chapter 10: The Legacy of an Era. When Rafael Caro Quintero returned to federal maximum security prison in 2022, it was not just a judicial chapter closing. It was a historical cycle closing. His trajectory spans nearly half a century of transformation in Mexican narco-trafficking, from rudimentary cultivation in the mountains to the consolidation of criminal structures with international reach, from a centralized control model to the violent fragmentation that redefined the crime map. Before the Camarena case, narco-trafficking operated under informal balances, tacit agreements, and violence levels contained within certain margins. After 1985, the conflict became internationalized. Bilateral cooperation intensified, and pressure on Mexican organizations increased steadily. The fall of the Guadalajara Cartel did not eliminate the business, it dispersed it. From its fracture emerged more autonomous, more aggressive, and less coordinated organizations. Competition for territories, routes, and markets led to a spiral of confrontations that would mark the following decades. Caro Quintero was part of the foundational moment of that process. His figure represents the transition between two eras, that of the producer who learned to industrialize cultivation, and that of the criminal system that ended up facing open war against the state. Over time, his name became a symbol. For some sectors, it embodied the old guard. For others, it represented responsibility for an irreversible breaking point in the Mexico-United States relationship regarding narco-trafficking. But beyond myth, the facts are clear. His story demonstrates how a criminal structure can grow by exploiting institutional voids, structural corruption, and sustained international demand. It also shows how a single decision, the kidnapping and murder of a foreign agent, can completely alter the balance of power. Today, Mexican narco-trafficking is different from what he helped consolidate. It operates with decentralized networks, advanced technology, and more unpredictable violence. The generation that founded the original model has been disappearing, replaced by actors who grew in an already fragmented environment. The final judicial fate of Rafael Caro Quintero continues to unfold in courts, but his historical impact is already written. His name remained linked to the birth of modern narco-trafficking in Mexico, and to the moment when that illegal industry stopped being a regional business to become an international conflict. If you found this documentary interesting, subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the stories that changed the world of organized crime. Here, we analyze documented facts, historical processes, and individuals who changed the course of entire countries. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We'll see you in the next episode.